Welcome to the Truth Expedition. I'm your host, Mark Bashofsky, and you have tuned into the show where we dig and scratch and claw for some tangible truth in this insane clown show of a world where fact checkers outright lie, the government and the media propagandizes you and me, the citizens of this amazing world. And I'm still flying high, everybody. From if you saw yesterday's event with attorney Aaron Siri, incredible. That was September 10th. So for a reference here, it is September 11th. 2023, and like I said, I'm still flying high from that event with Aaron Siri. If you didn't see that, we're going to have that produced, recorded, and posted. I'm still flying high, though. I wasn't able to land from the height of that flight because I was so excited for this interview today. You're going to find it amazing, this perspective that we are going to get today on this whole COVID situation, the scamdemic, plandemic, if you will. A unique perspective. Today, my guest is a scholar. You know, I've interviewed attorneys, I've interviewed doctors, pharmaceutical reps, people like that. But Thomas Harrington is a professor emeritus at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He teaches Hispanic and Iberian studies. He's also a contributor at the Brownstone Institute. He's an unlikely voice, I believe, in this COVID tyranny era, and has, like I said, a unique and valuable perspective on how these things happened, how they happened the way they did. Now, he has got a thorough understanding of our culture and its history. He is the author of the book Treason of Experts, COVID and the Credentialed Class, which is a collection of essays, I believe, he'd written going back, to the beginning of this pandemic. Professor Harrington, Tom, thank you so much for your time today. I'm so grateful.
Mark, I'm delighted to be here, really.
Excellent. So tell us, I mentioned, Hispanic studies. I studied a little Spanish 25 years ago, and I think the only thing I remember is my teacher said it to me every day. El chicle en la boca, en la papelera. So you speak, was it 5 different languages, 6 including English?
Pretty much so. I speak Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, which many people don't know about, which is the language of the region where Barcelona is in Spain, and is the language around which the nationalist movement there is rallying, and Italian, and Galician, which is another regional language of Spain, very similar to Portuguese, so that's easier. And then I've just come back from 6 months in Italy. My Italian is probably my least able language. I spent less time there, but I was on a Fulbright grant in Sardinia, which is a fascinating part of the world. It's an island off Italy with its own very un-Italian past. It's only been really Italian for 150 years. So yeah, I've been very lucky. I was kind of a dreamer of a kid, read his Hemingway novels. I think when I got out of college, I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself, or maybe do to myself. And reading my Hemingway's novels about going to Europe, I kind of developed this romantic idea of being the American kid who would go over and learn to speak to people in their own tongues and learn their stories. And I've been blessed to have a career that has allowed me to really go around the world dialoguing with people and listening to their stories, which for me is really the center of being alive. Dialogue for me is what humanizes us. Dialogue is for me where we get the most important lessons in our lives. It's where we learn how body language works. And of course, on a sour note, these are the things precisely in our mechanized world that so many people are trying to rob our children of having the experience of gaining these skills. So to me, face-to-face, hearing stories, assimilating stories, and learning that there's a lot of variety out there that you can learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, again, to the audience, and I highly recommend you read this book, Treason of the Experts, COVID and the Credentialed Class. So, I'd say you're in the credentialed class. You're within your colleagues, your peers. So, if you wouldn't mind defining, like in the book, who are the experts? Who are you referring to when you say the experts? Treason.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of play on the word expert today, and I was talking yesterday with some people about how metaphors look. There's the metaphor of something, in other words, the representation of it, and then there's the reality of it. And of course, sometimes the two things get confused. The reality of an expert is a person who knows things deeply and is deeply immersed and is searching deeply for the truth. But sometimes there can be just the metaphor of the expert, the person who has the title, who has the position, but who might not be swayed for the search for the truth, but might be swayed by political considerations, might be swayed by expediency career-wise. People who have their PhDs who are given wonderful jobs, like the type of job I was given as a tenured professor. And I guess what I'm saying with the title is, with to whom much is given, much is expected. And if you're put in this class, whom we pay nicely and give protections to, ostensibly to search for the truth, then you have a big responsibility not to let those other things overwhelm that search, not to just become someone who bears the metaphor of expertise rather than the reality of it. And I think we've slipped, for a lot of cultural reasons, perhaps we could talk about, into a situation where our culture, the people who have been privileged, have let go of that very serious responsibility to be seekers of the truth above all. Some might know the title, I mentioned it in the introduction, but the title of the book I'm borrowing from another famous book that was published in 1927, and it was called The Treason of the Clerks, or The Treason of the Intellectuals, by a French writer called Julien Benda. And he wrote it in 1927 after the horrendous bloodletting of the First World War. And he basically, it was an accusation of the intellectuals who had abdicated their responsibility. Instead of being seekers of the truth, they became cogs in the machine of the propaganda that led to the slaughter of millions and millions of people. And he's saying that they really betrayed their charter as intellectuals. And so I'm suggesting, I guess, in a similar way, that for whatever reasons, and again, we could talk about them, this class has become very interested in things other than the truth, and saying it loudly and clearly, and that we're all suffering from it.
Yeah, and I experienced that. You know, the big question I get is why me as a respiratory therapist? I mean, there's others, nurses. There's very few doctors that have been willing to dig for the truth. But the big question, and I think to a certain degree you answer the question, why did all these doctors just accept the narrative? You know, our de facto health expert of the world now is Bill Gates with his high school degree. You know, so, you know, I dealt in the hospital. I'm no longer there, but with these physicians, I would present studies to them. Hydroxychloroquine, in fact, was the first one. How the Lancet, you know, put out a study saying that, you know, it was useless, it was dangerous, but it was completely debunked, bogus data. But that was where the narrative stuck with the doctors. They stuck with that versus the truth. And I still can't wrap my head around how so many doctors wouldn't dig in.
Yeah. I come from a family of doctors, interestingly enough. I grew up around doctors, grandparents and uncles and cousins, brother. And I'm still shocked at the degree of conformity and lack of courage that I've seen in that cohort of people. I think yesterday I had the pleasure of meeting Joe Varon, who's been from the Frontline Doctors Coalition, whom you might be familiar with Pierre Corey and Paul Marek. And we got talking about, I think, a word that explains or can help to explain some of this. And again, I have this theory that when we don't use words, we're saying something because we're trying to avoid the responsibilities that come with them. For example, dignity is one of my favorite words that I come back to again and again. And I've noticed over the years how seldom the word dignity is used, because if you use it, you have to think of the concept. And if you have to think of the concept, you have to ask yourself the question of, am I promoting dignity among people? is the situation I am in dignified? But if you eliminate the word and let it slip out of your vocabulary, you don't. But the word we were talking about was vocation. Vocation is the idea that you do something for reasons that transcend the mere gaining of money or prestige. That you are committed, for lack of a better term, in a spiritual or a moral fashion to the pursuit of what you've been asked or have been lucky enough to do. And I think what we've seen, and I think it's a very interesting subject as it goes across our society, where is vocation in our society? And to what extent has our mania for a consumer culture converted all of us into people that think we are above all and only economic beings who simply seek status and or money? Well, there's a whole other set of human motivations that we seem to not be doing a good job of passing on to our children as possibilities around which you could build a life, around which you could actually build a vocation that might make you much happier than gaining a whole bunch of money and power. And that's probably the best explication I can come up with for the behavior of our doctors. I remember when I went to a college where they had a very well-known pre-med program. And again, having come out of this family as doctors and seeing my father being on call, doing house calls, spending every other weekend, not able to relax because of that, and sometimes several days during the week. I used to ask my friends, why do they want to become a doctor who are in the pre-med program? Well, I want to have a nice house. I really want to have a nice house and play a bunch of golf. And for better or worse, I think there has been a certain selection process that maybe those people now occupy a lot of the places in our medical hierarchy. I think the other thing is, and this is brought up with some of the doctors I've dealt with in the course of some of my writing, some of the ones who are dissidents, is the idea that it should be that there have been people who are 9-to-5ers now in medicine, and they want to be hospitalists. They want to be ophthalmologists, and I have nothing against those people. But a hospitalist is a person who thinks in terms of his 9 hours or 10 hours on the job, and that's fine, and goes home. And who can blame them from a lifestyle point of view? But there is a lack of continuity. So then things default from, again, these are from testimonies of other people, they default to protocols rather than hands-on constant monitoring by one person who's interested in the singularity of that one person who's in pain or in suffering and needs their help. And of course, that gets into the whole question of what kind of medicine do we want to do, and the whole game of what they call evidence-based medicine, which sounds wonderful, right? But evidence-based medicine has paradoxically led to the creation of protocols which take out the discretion of the given physician and the knowledge that he has accumulated or she has accumulated over the years. It's like a conversation being, if you see someone's body language in a conversation, you make adjustments in the conversation. Well, being a gifted healer is that as well. Not every person is the same. And you need to be able to be keen to those changes. And how can you do that if it's one person in 15 minutes, you're looking at your computer screen, or if you're in the hospital, you're checking in, looking at a chart and saying, hi, how you doing? Looks like everything is going well. Well, that's a healing of a very different sort if it's healing at all.
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, again, what a unique perspective. I worked with hospitalists, 9 to 5, 12-hour shifts, and you're absolutely right. It's a protocol, and they would just hand off their patient to the next hospitalist that would come in, and it was all protocol. Nothing against these doctors. I had an impeccable relationship with these doctors before I started questioning things, but it's this lack of thinking. I think part of it, you're absolutely right. nowadays they're in debt, and it's a lifestyle.
Yep.
They can't give up their job, and they're employed. They're not. There's very few private practice doctors where they can. So it's coming from CMS, from hospital administration, where it's like, this is what you can do, and if you do prescribe remdesivir and intubate them, we're going to get a huge bonus. So don't think, follow the protocol. So unfortunate.
That's one of the biggest scandals that has not yet been talked about, even within the movement of people questioning the COVID narrative, is these bonuses. I mean, I've seen some of the internal memos. I think it was out of Kentucky Blue Cross Blue Shield, which I'm sure were just the same for others. And they were basically saying, if you get X amount vaccinated, you get this big of a bonus. Oh, and by the way, if you don't, we might have problems with you before the medical board. Well, what are these people going to do who are in debt? And so in that sense, I have some compassion. They're in debt based on the premise that they're going to have a wealthy, not wealthy, but at least comfortable lifestyle. And they say, well, if I do that, everything's going down the tube. So in some ways, and I used to talk about this with my dad. He was frightened about what he called the coming of managed care. And all of his, he's not with us anymore, but all of his fears have come true. That the relationship between the doctor and the patient now no longer is really a relationship between the doctor and the patient. It's a relationship between a large corporation who's profit-seeking and people who they deploy to deploy pharmaceuticals in large measure, and for whom pharmaceuticals, as promoted by immensely rich companies, are seen as the first remedy to most human problems. And wow.
Yeah, and
that's a long way from someone looking into your eyes, taking your pulse, asking how you are, what you think about, what are the limits you want to put on the particular care, what you might know in your allegedly ignorant state about this condition, and how you might want to discuss that with that person. Wow, that's a big difference.
Yeah, managed care, and it should take note. So, under this managed care, we have not become healthier. In fact, I should point out, since 1984, when Anthony Fauci took, the reins at the helm of the NIH, in 1984, we had Americans had 6% rate of 6% of chronic illness. Now we're at 54. So if there's any, and we continue to be just ill in this country. We're one of the sickest populations in the world with our heart disease, cancer rates, and we're going nowhere with it. It's getting worse since Obamacare. It was supposed to be cheaper, more available. It's gotten more expensive, less available. We're going backwards. But I think the general population is just so busy with the rat race of a life to pay attention to what's happening to them.
And I think it has another aspect, and you have to ask yourself how much it's intentional, is that when you are chronically ill, you develop a self-image that thinks of yourself not as self-possessed or resilient. You think of yourself as someone chronically in need of the succor of another person. And I've got nothing against seeking the aid of other people and the comfort of other people. That's what being human is all about. But to be in a position where you chronically need, for your basic functioning, the intervention of a huge, powerful institution in your life, that creates an outlook on what life is about inside people's heads. And it creates an idea that I am not self-sufficient in a basic sense. I am always, and we are always dependent on others, don't get me wrong, but that I am in a place of being back on my heels, living my life, because if that was ever taken away, I would be lost. And I think we're giving that message earlier and earlier to young people, and for better and for and why, I don't know why the chronic illness is happening. I'm not a physician to say, or a researcher, but I have some ideas, and I think most of us do. But I think of that in a larger framework of feudalism. And when we talk about feudalism, it rings some vague bells in most people's mind: Middle Ages, dark castles, knights, swords and shields. But to understand feudalism was a system in which depended on the fundamental feeling of the common person as being vulnerable. And given the vulnerability in a warring Europe, in let's say the 12th or 13th century, the idea was that I cannot defend myself without the power of a lord who will protect me and has the walls into which I can run when the people from the other kingdom come. So I will give away my freedom in order to have the protection of the Lord, the Lord in this sense, obviously meaning a noble. But what do you give up? You give up your autonomy as a person. You give up your intimacy as a family. You give up your right not to go to war, because part of the implied bargain was that if and when that noble needs you to go to war, you go to war, etc. And even in some cases, the famous case of if he wants to have sex with your daughter, he can do that too. So I'm always on guard when we get talking about things that put us in a state of chronic, and I think that's the key word, chronic dependence on a faceless authority. I'm all for dependence on loved people and trusted people. That's what life's about. But chronic dependence on something faceless, I think inevitably leads to a great loss of autonomy in general.
Yeah, we're definitely headed towards this concept of all-out collectivism, and kind of personal responsibility is being removed. And I'm a little out of order here, but I want to jump back because you talk a lot about, and today is 9/11. Bless those that were lost, and I have tons of questions about 9/11. I don't believe the main narrative, but that's another conversation. But you do bring up 9/11 and how it's somewhat led to this, and how it kind of relates to the behaviors of the privileged and how we've gotten here. If you want to comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency, even among people who are disturbed by what we're both disturbed by in terms of the COVID, the way things have gone over the last 3 years, there's a tendency among people to want to believe that it was all going well until 2020, and that these attempts to intervene in our lives at the level that we had the government and others intervening in our lives were brand new. I think that's a historically short-sighted view. I work, as you probably know from the book, what my academic specialty was formerly Hispanic studies, but I really was looking at nationhood and how nations are formed and maintained, and how elites create discourses or the arrangement of signs and symbols in our daily life to funnel us towards certain conclusions about how the world works and what we need to do. My great mentor, Evan Zohar, calls it sociosemiotic training, or sociosemiotic culture planning. The idea being that cultures are planned, that they're not spontaneous. We think we're swimming in the sea of culture that's just swashing around. But he would argue, and I agree with him, that cultures are never spontaneous. And the empowered elites, be they financial and or sign making, which would say writers, Hollywood, artists, working in concert with entrenched power, have an enormous role in creating what passes for reality. So with that as a sort of prologue, I would argue that in the intense phase of the rearranging of reality in society really began after 2001. Whatever your thoughts are on the genesis of the bombing itself, it was very clear that within weeks, that the idea of everything has changed was something more than a suggestion. It meant that everything was going to change and that you better get rid of it. And what that meant was you are going to see yourself more as a subject than a citizen. You are, in the name of staying free from terror, going to give away your constitutional rights when it came, for example, to having your car searched at the airport. You were going to give away your right to talk freely among yourselves in electronic communication, because we know the Bush administration began that right away. You were going to give up your right to talk back to the idea of war as the solution for all things. As we can see, the very concerted attacks on prominent intellectuals who were against the overreaction, in my view, of what we did after that. Susan Sontag, who was really one of the great living intellectuals at the time, she said, can we discuss this overreaction? Susan Sontag, who was been esteemed for years by everyone as a great intellectual, was slammed. Phil Donahue had the leading talk show on I think it was MSNBC or one of the NBC, and he had the leading talk show, and he got canned, and they were pretty clear about it. We're not going to allow anti-war voices in this time, or voices that even begin to question the attack, the approach the United States was taking after the attack. And of course, one of the most telltale things was the passing of the Patriot Act within, I think, 30 days, if not a little bit more. 342 pages of draconian cutbacks on basic rights. Now, either they got very fast writers somewhere in the government and very fast lawyers, or there had to be these things hanging around in embryonic form somewhere within the federal bureaucracy that were then packaged in the midst of the shock that people felt at that time. So I'm a little impatient with those who say this began in 2020, and I think you need to see it as a continuum. And I won't let Obama off the hook by any means. And I think his presidency was one of the great bait and switches in all of history. And I tried to warn some of my then friends on the left about it. What makes you think this guy is going to do anything about it? Well, he said he was going to do it. Well, the first thing we know Obama did after getting the nomination in the summer of 2008 was to desist from his opposition to the illegal wiretapping that the Bush administration was carrying out. He didn't close Guantanamo. So he sent a clear signal to the people in charge, hey, with me, you're not going to have any trouble with continuing to wiretap the American people. And when I saw that, was one of those signals that comes and flashes you in the face and it says, oh, okay, I get where you're coming from now. And I tried to warn people, but people wanted to believe in hope and change. And then going on, murdering American citizens with drones, as we know in the al-Awlaki case, calling it due process, and having the nerve to call it due process, because a group of people huddled in the White House basement and said that we had decided he was guilty. And then he sends out his attorney general, Eric Holder, and said, we gave due process to the al-Awlaki family who we murdered from a drone, American citizens. And on. I could go on and on and on. So we've been having our rights peeled back progressively for 20 years in an intense form. And I would go back even further if your listeners can be patient with me. And I would go back to 1970s Europe, which I think was a turning point. The years after 1945, the end of the war, until about in 1980, 75, were moments of with all the other problems we had with race and with all the other problems we had with poverty in certain places, they were years of extraordinary expansion of citizen rights, both in Europe and in America. And part of that, I think, was due to the fact that the elites felt that after the bloodletting of the war, they had to give something to the common people to retain their sense of investment in the society. And that pact of giving, creating free healthcare, free education, expanding who could go to college, expanding civil rights, began to show cracks in the late 70s. In Europe, we started to see people like the Red Brigades and the Italian, the Brigate Rossi, I think they were called in Italian. And we begin to see consternation in the elites about what we can do with these people who are saying this amount of democracy is not enough and wanted more. And that's where Italy, I think, becomes a very important laboratory. When Italy had very serious leftist uprisings against what had been a managed coalition, very much with the United States involved, in keeping the Christian Democrats in office for the first 30 years after the war. And the communists began to challenge that. And the Italian state, and we now know this pretty much beyond doubt, the Italian state began to plan, or at least cooperate in, terrorist attacks upon their own people. The idea being that if we could frighten the people enough about what the left was capable of doing, then we could reinforce their devotion to the Christian Democrats who we wanted to keep in office. And that is a real breach with anything having to do with civic respect for the society. What you're basically saying is we need to retain control as we see it slipping away, and we're disposed to attacking our own people in order to create a spectacle which will allow people to be frightened, and in that fright, reaffirm their devotion to the state that they were losing faith in. Think of that as a template. Think of that as a template. The idea that I can no longer manage you and your increasing desires for real democracy, therefore I need to frighten you back into the existing parameters that we provide you. And if you begin to meditate on that template, you begin to see that maybe it's been used more than a few times since then.
Yeah, you mentioned politics of fear, and I think you just kind of referenced what was the strategy of tension. So
the strategy of tension is what strategia della tensione. It's what is generally referred to in Italy. And the Bologna bombing of 1980 at the Bologna railway station is really the biggest, but there were several other bombing attacks in the late 70s. In fact, I had some time during my Italian sojourn that I just ended up a meeting with some very interesting people, one of whom told me the story about when he's about my age, so he was probably born in 1960, early 1960s, and he was an amateur football player, and he said he had all these friends that were getting involved with the radical movements where he was in northeast Italy. And he said there was a lot of boisterousness. They would have fun, smoke weed, and protest. He said a few years later, heroin had entered into all of this, and that the heroin had been mostly supplied from some of the U.S. bases that were on Italian soil. Now, I can't vouch for whether that's true or not, but if you've read some things like Douglas Valentine's books on the use of drugs, not only as a way of having slush funds, that the government would sell drugs for slush funds, but heroin's a wonderful way to make suddenly lazy revolutionaries. It has a nice way of blunting, so I'm told, their desire to be boisterous and rowdy and questioning things.
Yeah.
So again, second hand, third hand, but I've been told it.
You look at, I just read an article by James Corbett, alternative journalism, about the heroin supply, the poppy growing in Afghanistan, how, the Taliban had it pretty much under control. We came in, poppy's growing like crazy, and CIA is slinging heroin around the world. Like, I don't know. I don't have the evidence, but I think you're really onto something there. I don't doubt any of that at all. And you mentioned, this goes back to the 70s, and pre-interview we talked about, I think a lot of this, the privileged class and the control could go back a century. The Federal Reserve, we had no income tax, then the Federal Reserve came, then income tax came, then the takeover of medicine by the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the getting rid of natural care and herbs and that kind of thing, leading all the way up to the 70s with this fear-mongering kind of started with the global warming then, and it all just kind of leads to now where we are in this really, really draconian state of affairs. And it's, a lot of it's speculation.
Yeah, no, I think there's another way to look at it, meta-historically, if you want to, and it's an idea that's been bouncing around in my head a lot lately. And when we talk about modernity, it's depending on how you look at it, but generally the historians, they call themselves students of modernity starting in the 1500s. The modern project, which often overlaps with the Renaissance, is the idea that human beings increasingly can be counted on to figure out the world and to control its features and control its outcomes. And thank goodness for that, right? We're all the beneficiaries of modernity. But modernity has a couple of implicit values within it. And one is the idea of linear progress. I'm going to know more today than I knew yesterday, and that if I quantify things and measure things and read them, I will always know more, and on it will go ad infinitum until we figure everything out. You know, a teleological or end-directed idea of the world, and that we just need to stay on the track and we'll get smarter and smarter and smarter at all times. Well, it's a nice theory, and it's one that's very stimulating to science and has been very stimulating to science, but it doesn't take into account the fallibility of human beings. It doesn't take into account the enormous self-deception that human beings can engage in. It doesn't take into account the need that linear progress or the pursuit of it can have in the destruction of local cultures and drug cultures, if you want to, or all sorts of knowledge cultures that might in their own way have wisdoms that we haven't plumbed yet. And we sometimes get rid of them in the name of this progress, but that is a progress working within a very limited paradigm, considering the vastness of the world. And so we lose our sense of awe and wonder for creation, our ability to listen to creation and allow it to teach us in a reflective way. And we say, no, we've got a method. We're going to go forward with this method, and it'll make us smarter. And I think in some ways, if we look at what's going on metahistorically, is that we're coming to the end of a 5-year cycle where that method delivered us huge results, but we're now in the phase of diminishing returns. And yet, instead of asking really deep questions about that paradigm, we are doubling down on it, even as it brings us diminished returns. And I think there's a sort of fright within the intellectual class who has embraced this teleology, this paradigm with a religious fervor, that it's not working. And the dumb people are showing us that it's not working, and things are going back. Well, that might be a moment for reflection. But no, we've got the answer, we've got the paradigm, and if the quote unquote dumb people don't get it, we call them names and we have to censor them. Because who knows, they couldn't have a knowledge, they couldn't have a sensibility that might be worth listening to, that might even reinvigorate the machine we are so attached to. No. We've got it. We've done the schooling. We've got the answers. We've got the paradigm. Those people are ignorant, and we need to silence their voices. And this to me, and there's a piece in the book you might have read, What Everybody Knows, in which I was contrasting my time spent in a rural area of Connecticut with what I was seeing in the Zoom meetings with my colleagues in regard to the COVID threat. And it was amazing. My colleagues who have some of the safest jobs in America were invariably frightened to death about the very idea of stepping in a classroom with unvaccinated or unmasked people. And yet, out in rural Connecticut, where I was there because of my wife's work, I was talking to people, maskless, carpenters, masons, all sorts of people who hustle every day for a job. They knew the statistics of mortality much better and much more realistically than did my colleagues. They had the palpable experience of working unmasked beside all sorts of people and knowing that not all of them are dropping dead. And the other thing I think I mentioned in the piece is these are people who, unlike a tenured professor, has to make risk calculations every day. I mean, one of the beauties of my job, for which I can only be grateful, was that once I was on my way, I mean, there was a lot of risk calculation in the early part when you never know whether you're going to get a job or finish your PhD or whatever. But once you're on your way in a nice job, you're not making risk calculations. But a carpenter who's working in a rural area of Connecticut or any other place he knows very well what it means to make risk calculations every day. He's very good at it. And if he's not good at it, he's going to be in big trouble. And that just blew my mind. So that's knowledge. That's knowledge of the type that we're told doesn't emanate from the uncredentialed class. And yet it emanates in large quantities from the uncredentialed class. And I think if we were a little more humble, we'd be well advised to learn how to assimilate it into our lives.
Yeah, I think, that's wisdom. I was just going to bring that up. You led into it beautifully, the what everybody knows. I found that passage very interesting, and that perspective unique, because I witnessed it myself. I've got carpenter friends, and I would say, having an education, what is intellect, what is intelligence, somebody who can build things, understand the world around them. I think you're right. Those are the people that have these risks daily, and we're able to look at the numbers, 99.77, survival rate, looking into the studies about masks that they don't work, and, calculating the risk. So, those, for the viewers out there, those are the kinds of things in the book that you're going to get this really unique perspective. And I'd like to talk about, you mentioned consumerism a lot in the book, and I think that to me is like, so I'm a free market guy, so much as to say I'm almost a anarcho-capitalist. I have like zero trust in the government. But consumerism, I think, is kind of what's wrong with us as a species. Just this, when did this happen? I remember when I was in college, I wrote a paper on this, like if you didn't have the Nike shoes, you weren't cool, and image became so important. It's to keep up with the Joneses and in letting go of what's really important in life, which is love, the comforts of home, and those kinds of things. And consumerism, though I'm a free market guy, has led us just down this destructive path.
I'm glad you brought that up, because it is a theme that comes back again and again. And when I speak of consumerism, I'm not saying I'm against markets per se, but I'm really talking about a culture that grew out of markets that obviates other values that aren't the acquisition of things to make you happy. Yeah. There's a great scholar named Zygmunt Bauman. I think I probably mentioned him more than once in the book. He's a Polish scholar, and he has a wonderful essay called Tourists and Vagabonds, in which he says that consumer culture basically turns us into sensation seekers. And the sensation seeker is a person that says, I want to get that. They get it. They get bored with it. They forget why they wanted it, and they're on to seek the next sensation. And they forget about what it was that drove their dopamine or whatever it was to get that sensation, and then they move on. So we become memoryless people, always seeking the next sensation, but unable to enjoy the sensation that we thought would make us whole or make us complete. And I think it's a wonderful way of looking at it. There's another thinker that I think is really important in this, and it gets to the sort of sensations that we get through electronic media, and that's Guy Debord, who was a French intellectual who wrote The Society of the Spectacle in 1967, in which he basically argued that consumerism leads us to a place where we're enveloped by the spectacle. Everything in our midst becomes so mediated that we are unmediated, meaning having something between us and it, that by commercial concerns or by materialistic concerns, that we become trapped in it and unable to reach beyond to the things, to have relatively unmediated experiences like sensing the beauty of a walk in the woods. And he says the spectacle self-feeds itself, and that we get trapped in it to the point where we don't even know we're in it. But I also want to address one of what you said about its relationship to free markets, because one of the nicest things and most interesting things with my work at Brownstone has been that I am in constant contact with anarcho-capitalists, or sometimes what I would refer to as former anarcho-capitalists, who, when I bring up the consumer business and how it can create tyrannies and how we may need moral restraints on the free market, that they're not comfortable with, it's been very interesting for me to have fruitful dialogues about that with these people, and have some of them admit that, well, it may not be self-correcting. The market may not be fully self-correcting. And while you don't want to invite all sorts of overarching powers into the market, it still raises the question of what will regulate its ability to turn us into consumerist zombies. I think the original ideas of many of the anarcho-capitalists and libertarians was they took for granted that the ethical restraints of perhaps religion, community, and other things would always be there. And so they assumed that they would always exercise a restraint upon the consumerist market's ability to become free-floating from human values. And I don't think they foresaw that possibility. And I think we're seeing that possibility. And I think it raises a whole bunch of new questions. And I think you're seeing this play out now in this sort of merging of certain people who are libertarian by bent, who are seeing eye to eye with certain people of the hard left who want freedom, but also realize that there needs to be certain restraints on the market because the market can also turn tyrannical. Just read a book by a guy named Sohrab Ahmari, and it's called Tyranny Incorporated. And for the most part, it's a reprise of the restraints that we used to have. But his argument is that free markets are great until they're not. And then they become tyrannical. And it's not always just the government that makes them tyrannical. The accumulations of capital can make them tyrannical when they get to the point where they get to. And I think, needless to say, we're at that point. Yeah. So then the question becomes, what kind of restraints and from where and how? And this is why I always go back to moral questions, and everyone says, well, that sounds dreamy. And I go, well, not really. We can call it dreamy. You know, we have this American tendency, but what's the solution in policy terms? Well, I don't have a solution in policy terms, but I know we need to talk about these things among ourselves for a policy if it ever comes to trickle up. And we're not doing that, I don't think, because we think we want the policy prescription first.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, when it comes to that whole concept, if you're not familiar, viewers, with what anarcho-capitalism is, it's basically no governments, and that you're for free markets, and the market will correct itself. And I have a million questions with anarcho-capitalism. If there's no governments, because it's the governments of the world that play with coronaviruses and make them chimerically deadly. But wouldn't the free market business, wouldn't a pharmaceutical company do that on their own if there weren't governments? I mean, there's evil. The world is run to a certain degree by psychopaths. So it's complex, and anarcho-capitalism is fascinating. It's going to take a huge evolution in moral thought change in order for something like that to ever work. Yeah.
Just one more thing I'd like to add on that. I think that consumer capitalism has consumerism. Again, I'm not against capitalism. I'm against this idea that we become merely seekers of consumer sensations. I think it has another really corrosive effect that we've seen during COVID, and it touches on what we were talking about earlier. People begin to see everything in transactional terms. Let's go back to our doctors. Now, I'm sure some of those doctors have moral scruples about had moral scruples and have moral scruples about what's going on. But they've been raised in a culture of transactionalism. I give you this, you give me that leaves no place for moral considerations. Either you do it or you don't, and you get or you don't get what you're exchanging. My labor to the practice I'm in, which is run by an investment group, which has fealty to the pharmacies. So that guy, he says, or that woman, she says, well, I've got a mortgage and the kids. I can't make a stand on a moral basis because I'm caught in a transactional relationship where moral considerations have no purchase, have no value within that relationship. And of course, you could criticize them, but that's the world they've grown up in. And perhaps many of them didn't think about, well, what happens when that transactional relationship is taken to immoral ends? Where am I going to find the resources, personally and morally, never mind financially, to be able to make a stand within that context. And if you haven't done that sort of practicing, or if you haven't gained that practicing mentally in your life, chances are you're going to fold in that moment. And that gets to a whole other interesting thing about, you know, how much does this idea of inexorable progress stop us from thinking and meditating on the many times where human cultures have gone berserk and what that would call upon us to do. You know, we get these Hollywood movies and they say, oh, the Nazis were terrible and everyone was walking around, and but so-and-so stood up to it, and the person sitting at home in their nice chair goes, well, that's going to be me. Of course, I would never go along with the rounding up of the Jews. Well, first of all, it might not be about the rounding up of the Jews. And second of all, if that didn't provoke you to gaming your moral response in a would-be situation, well, then the coercion's going to come, and you're going to be sitting there as freshly surprised as many of the Nazis who are all of a sudden told to turn on their fellow citizens. And frighteningly enough, this is what we saw, although no one wants to talk about it today. We saw people that were able, under the coercion exercised by a combination of pharma and government, quote unquote, incentives, to turn on a dime against family members, to turn on a dime against friends, to turn on a dime against colleagues, to consign people to dying alone, to consign people to having their kids lose valuable cognitive developmental time by having masks on their face. And they simply repeated to themselves, the people in charge have told me it's for our own good. I want to be one of the good people, and therefore I do it. Well, they hadn't gained much, had they?
Right. That's, yeah, absolutely, 100%. You know, on consumerism, again, I hate it too. You know, as much as I am a free market guy, I really truly believe that that is what is wrong with this our whole society is, you know, and I'm guilty to it to a certain degree.
Of course, we all live in this society.
Yeah.
So while I'm saying these things, I am also a product of it. But the least I think we can ask of selves and others is having some perspective on yourself. Because when you begin to look at yourself in terms of the ways you react to pressures, you say, well, maybe I don't want to act that way the next time. You know, and I think it's the people who think, no, I'm in the catbird seat. I know what I'm doing. Well, we don't often know. We don't always know what we're doing.
Yeah, you're right. And it's like it's a snowball effect. You want this thing, you think it's going to bring you happiness. Maybe it does for a moment, but then you want the next thing, and it just continues, and it's out of control. It's truly out of control. And if we want to have a better world, I think we're going to have to get back to, you know, what really is happiness. And it's not things, it's not material items. I mean, I think we all know that deep down, but we're kind of trapped in this, you know, the society, like you say. It's,
yeah.
There's so many things, so many passages from your book, Tom, that we'll get to a few of them here. But yeah, you got to read this book, folks. I'm telling you. But I'm going to read this one thing. So this is something that I think a lot of us in our circles talk about. But this is your friend Pete, who committed suicide. Yeah. So I'm going to read this part if you don't mind here, and then I'll let you comment. But this struck me in the book. That said, I nonetheless feel compelled to ask all those out there currently justifying draconian reductions of basic human liberties and, worse yet, human customs of love and caring on the basis of inflated case numbers spawned by a deeply flawed PCR test as well as a 0.23% infection fatality rate, if they might be willing to admit that Pete was also a real COVID fatality. And more fundamentally, I'd like to ask all those that constantly tell us about the grave threat posed by COVID, with its 99.77% survival rate and victim cohort tilted overwhelmingly to those that are at or beyond their normal life expectancy, if, after playing profligately and abusively with the threat of death, that they have any empathy left for the real and concrete terminations of life catalyzed, if not caused, by their serial exaggerations, or do they simply consider such questions to be another thing to be deplatformed? And that is happening. So many people. The depression, the suicides, people dying from drug overdose. I mean, that is the real pandemic here, but you can't talk about it. You're deplatformed. It's all about the 99.77% survival rate, and you're called crazy if you even cite that.
Yeah. It's truly nuts. I mean, what we're seeing with the deaths now of young people dropping dead and athletes dropping dead, and this amazing ability not to see it and say, it's a mystery. I mean, I've been a sports fan and a heavy duty one for about 50 years. I mean, I know I can mention the one heart attack of a player that I remember was John Hiller, who was a relief pitcher for the Detroit Tigers many years ago and came back and had a great career. And I remember what the effect it made. He was the only athlete in the age of in his age of activity that I had ever heard. And then for several years thereafter, I'm a soccer fan. I spent a lot of time in Europe. This just didn't happen. Yeah. People didn't drop dead on fields. And yet we have had the pressure not to say that, and the fear of being called a conspiracy theorist for simply pointing out that this is wildly anomalous is nuts. Or looking at the total mortality rates of people between the ages of 18 and 49. We're looking at an extraordinary, unprecedented rise in those deaths. And we could talk about whether, but surely suicide, drug addiction, the vaccines themselves, we know, and a number of things. And we're asked every day not to pretend it's not happening. And most people are willing to pretend that it's not happening. And this is truly amazing. That story I wrote about was in the very early days. If I'm not mistaken, that was in if you check the date on that article, I think I wrote that in February of 21. So this was before even the vaccine mandates were happening. And that was a guy who had been in the cruise industry and had no employment and was sitting around the house. What happened? What happened? The heart goes out to him, and yet we're supposed to say this didn't happen. I was with a woman yesterday at one of our meetings whose husband died alone in the hospital after being put on a remdesivir protocol that he hadn't asked for. And she was, and then they were talking about drive-by funerals. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I mean, go back to your Greek classics, Antigone, the great Greek tragedy about the daughter who had to make sure that the body of her father, the king, was returned to the earth in a dignified fashion. The Greeks wrote about this 2,500 years ago. You have a deep obligation to treat those you love in death with the dignity. And think of the indignities that were played out on all these people that were unable to touch in those last moments, unable to have that often horrible but also closure feeling of touching the warm hand and then touching the cold hand certainly after that. An experience I've had a couple of times that is deeply moving and makes you reflect on all sorts of important things. And that was taken away. As if we were already doing a good job of having the elderly, who are traditionally a fount of wisdom, be shared with our society as such. We've been packing these people away so that grandchildren never really get that relationship with a grandparent, which in my personal experience, and I know many others, is one of the most enriching relationships a child can have, because it brings perspective, it brings historical knowledge, it brings the ability to listen and make sense of things said in a slightly different language from a slightly different time. Those are important lessons for a child. And we weren't doing that well before this, and now we consign people to be dying alone. I mean, I could go on.
Yeah.
The outrages that were committed, and we're all supposed to say, well, it was all done for a good cause. And what cause was that? Something that, if you look at the Swedish experiment, we know, had we done almost nothing, we would have gotten better results than the ones we did. And if we look at the African experience with vaccines, we would have done probably better without the vaccines. And we're supposed to all say, oh, well, it just happened. It's too divisive to talk about it now. Let's move on. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Exactly. That was the worst thing in my opinion. I mean, aside from right now, all the people dying for what I believe, so many of these people dying from the vaccine and deaths of despair. But the worst thing was watching, because I worked in a COVID unit, and these people were dying. They knew they were dying. They were going to die in a day. They were going to die in a day or two, and they couldn't have family come in. The first several months, you could have nobody there. So I held their hand. This is no exaggeration, of at least a dozen people. Watch them take their last breath in my space suit, PAPR gear, my protective equipment. I'd hold their hand and watch them take their last breath, and it destroyed me. These elderly people having to live their last year or two in isolation in nursing homes. It is so horrible, and we know. In fact, we knew. I would argue we knew before this. The experts knew that lockdowns weren't the ticket. This wasn't the way to do this, and now we know for sure. But again, you're gaslit if you try to bring this up.
Well, I think it's very interesting that in these last few moments here, both you and I have expressed anger. And I think another thing, and I don't know if I go much into it in the book, anger is a very human and often productive human emotion. I think it was at St. Augustine, it said that anger has two beautiful daughters, justice, and I forget the other one. But this idea that that if you get angry, that, well, what's wrong with him? He's angry. Well, you should be angry sometimes. You don't want to rage at people. You don't want to, be destructive with your anger. But admitting that your anger can be, and channeling it toward justice is something that we need to become comfortable with. And I think there's been a war on anger. And when I say that again, healthy anger, for a long time in our country. And I think it's taken a toll on people. People are very hesitant about being angry. But anger, if well used, is a very powerful thing.
Yeah, I agree. Anger, passion directed the right way is what is needed right now if we want to change the direction we are going here. So yeah, I understand we're almost out of time here, and I'd love to have you on again, Thomas. I'd love to talk to you for hours and hours and learn from your wisdom. But
I'd be delighted, Mark.
I'd like to finish with I thought this was just profound. We get called conspiracy theorists all the time, which I think a conspiracy theorist is just somebody who's willing to ask questions, is willing to think critically. But I think you reference Michael Parenti, his response to be called a conspiracy theorist, and I just love this, so I'm going to read it. The alternative is to believe that the powerful, the privileged, are somnambulists, sleepwalkers, who move about oblivious to questions of power and privilege, that they always tell the truth and have nothing to hide, even when they hide so much, that although most of us ordinary people might consciously try to pursue our own interest, wealthy elites do not. That when those at the top employ force and violence around the world, it is only for the laudable reasons they profess. That when they arm, train, and finance covert actions in numerous countries and then fail to acknowledge their role in such deed, it is because of oversight or forgetfulness or perhaps modesty, and that it is merely a coincidence how the policies of the national security state so consistently serve the interests of the transnational corporations and the capital accumulation system throughout the world. I think you might want to get the book and read that yourself. I didn't give it, its true value there, but that to me says it all. Like, the privileged don't know what they're doing. They're oblivious to it. They don't have a motive.
I think we're wired to want to believe that there are people above us with power that are looking out for us. I mean, after all, we were all children once, and we had parents, and we had to work on the assumption, although it wasn't always true in all cases, that they loved us and were working for the best thing, and they were doing so as flawed human beings, just as I'm a father who is a flawed human being trying to do my best, I hope, for my children. I think that that instinct in us, when we get into the larger world, gets transmogrified or transferred to powerful people. And we want to believe, oh, he's rich. He must have done something right. He must have powers that I don't have. Therefore, I'm going to consign or assume there's a goodwill and a clairvoyance in that person that I might not have, and I will be deferential to that person. I think it's an error to do that. Your parents are your parents. And while you don't want to go around the world being hostile to anyone with authority, you should, when you become an adult, have a series of means tests that you apply to everyone in your life. And again, I'm a huge believer in going into relationships open and expecting the best. But you need to calibrate as the relationship unfolds. Is that person working in the same way and in the same spirit? And that should be something normal you do. And I would argue something that comes out of the socialization process if it's done well within the family unit. So it's no wonder that they're trying to breed those things out of our socialization process by getting institutions involved. But I think a lot of adults, having grown up in a largely successful post-war era, kind of went on autopilot in regard to power. We just assumed, and I think it's part of the American dream, he's above me, he must be smarter. Well, no, that's not always the case. And Spain was very helpful to me in this sense. I remember seeing a very famous rich guy go by in the street where I was with some Spanish friends, and they said, oh, that guy, if he's rich, he stole. And it shocked my American ideas, my American mentality. But they know from a very different history, they just assume if you're rich, you've stolen. Whereas I was brought up in, if he's doing well, it's because he's brilliant. And somewhere in between is probably the truth. Yeah, there are brilliant people. And when they say brilliant things and do good things, more power to them. But don't assume that's the case, as you wouldn't assume with most people in your life.
Yep, exactly. Yep, and I think a lot of people are now catching on that our American ways, at least people in my circles, understand that they might have stole. And you're probably right, it's somewhere in between. And some of it's psychopathy. I'm pretty sure there are psychopaths at the top, sociopaths.
And don't forget that certain social systems select for psychopathy. And don't forget the role of Hollywood films in all of this with their happy endings. It's all going to work out in the end. It's all going to work out in the end, really? Well, that's what you can believe when you're in a very wealthy country that has controlled much of the world. But having studied the Spanish Empire and many other empires, it doesn't always end. It doesn't always work out in the end. Things fall apart, as the famous W.B. Yeats quote goes. Things do fall apart.
Yeah, and I think we're witnessing our empire starting to fall apart, and that's why we're talking about these important issues and trying to restabilize it. And so please do read we got into it. You understand now the richness, the depth of the perspective you're going to get when it comes to all different concepts, issues in the scamdemic. When it comes to case-demics, Thomas's perspective there is unique. So many different angles that you're going to be able to use in your arguments. So read the book, Treason of the Experts, COVID in the Credentialed Class by Thomas Harrington. And I want to thank you, Tom, for giving us some of your time today. I'd like to have you on again, but thank you so much for being here.
It was a pleasure for me, really. Thank you.
Well, thank you for tuning into the Truth Expedition. Don't shed on me and don't tread on me.